come into our church and they hear the gospel, and yet they are not offended by their sin, we've done a terrible job of presenting the gospel to them. We see, first of all, the anger of the people. We see verses 24 through 29, the arrest of Paul. Paul's arrested a second time now in the same case, in the same time, right? The first time was outside the walls to save him. As we look at verses 24 through 29, we see that observing the uproar and probably unable to understand what's being said, the chief captain has Paul arrested and beat again and commands him to be beaten. Look at verse 24. And the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks. He doesn't know what's going on. All he knows is the people are in uproar again, and they're throwing their clothes off, and they're stirring up dust, all because of what this guy has just said. So therefore, we need to teach him a lesson. And so let's arrest him again, and this time let's beat him. That's the whole point. And said that he should be examined under scourging. So we're going to take him into interrogation, and we're going to beat him until we find out what's going on. Aren't you glad that that's not how our legal system here works today? Innocent until proven guilty, I think, is a really important phrase that we get to appreciate. But just before they get ready to beat him, though, Paul does something interesting here. As we look at verse number 25, and it says, "And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, 'Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?'" Important verse, important phrase. Why? Because it was illegal to arrest and beat a Roman citizen who has not been given due process of law. He had not been convicted. Here, obviously, the commander did not know he was Roman. He knew that he was a Jewish person. He knew that he was stirring up issues and trouble. He did not know he was a Roman citizen. And so in order to get the truth out of him, they're going to beat him until he gives up the truth. And just as they're getting ready to beat him, Paul says to the centurion standing there, "Would you beat an uncondemned Jewish person?" And I find it interesting because when Paul was arrested in Philippi by Romans, what happened that night? What did they do to him and Silas, before they put him in stocks? They beat him. Paul didn't use that argument there, did he? He didn't say, "Wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't beat me." He didn't use it. He took the beating. So let's think for a moment here. Why is it that Paul, at this particular time, in this particular case, does pull out the race card? That's what he does, right? "I'm Roman. You can't beat me." So why does he do it here, but he did not do it before? Do you think that Paul revealed his citizenship in order to avoid another beating like he had received in Philippi? What do you think? I don't want to go through that again. "I'm Roman. Here's my citizenship card." What do you think? Or do you want to just know what I think? I like to hear your responses. That's why I ask. Right. That would have been it. Probably killed. Yep. Oh. Yep. Okay, so if he was concerned about getting a beating again, that's what I'm trying to say. Would he have come to Jerusalem to begin with? How many times did he say, how many warnings did he get about going to Jerusalem because you might get a beating? How many times did he get warned? 3 times, right? All 3 times, what did he say every single time? "I will not be moved." Yes, I know. In fact, he specifically states, 1 or 2 chapters previous, "I may very well die in Jerusalem." I don't think he's concerned about the beating here. I don't think that's why he pulls out the race card. He's already determined, I'm going to probably die in Jerusalem. So I think what it is exactly what Stephen said. Because if I die here, my ability to testify of the gospel dies with me. Now, certainly his reputation goes on and his testimony goes on, but his ability to physically, verbally share the gospel with anybody else is over. And Paul's whole point in his life was that he wanted to use the gospel and to share with as many people as he possibly could. On top of that, he has already mentioned, and we know this from our study of Romans chapter 1, there's at least one other place he eventually wants to get with the gospel, and where is that? It's Rome. And Paul lays this whole thing out beautifully because we're going to realize this is the first of, I think, 3 steps in which Paul is going to be able to go to Rome and to share the gospel with the most powerful person in the whole world, and that's Caesar. That's his point. That's his goal. And so Paul says, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't touch me. Well, what's this guy going to do now? Well, he's going to pass him up to the next guy up the chain. And then he's going to keep passing him up because he's a Roman citizen. I don't want to deal with that. I'm not going to beat him. I'm not going to deal with him. I'm going to let somebody else deal with him. And Paul knows that. Paul realizes I'm a Roman citizenship. As far as my ability to share the gospel right now, the door is wide open. Stephen. Yep.
Figuring out, okay, I tried to reach these people this way, it did not work. Okay, and just almost like strategy.
It is. It is. In fact, we're going to see as we move on to the end of this chapter and moving into 23, we're going to continue to see the strategy play out. Paul is brilliant, actually, when you think about it. And you're going to be, and I think, I hopefully you'll be able to see the brilliance of his plan as we continue to go, because what happens next here is this, as we look at verse number 29, when the commander finds out, nobody touch Paul. Take your hands off him, unbind him, whatever you need to do. He's a Roman citizen. I don't want Rome coming down on my head. Look at verse number 29. Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was Roman, and because he had bound him. In fact, notice I hadn't planned to go into this next little part of the speech here, but look at here what Paul says. The commander in verse number 27 says, then the commander says, tell me, are you Roman? He says, yes. And the commander answered, with a large sum I obtained this citizenship. So what does the commander say here? I purchased with a large amount of money. I purchased my Roman citizenship. Now, there's a couple ways you could become a Roman citizen. One of them was to be born Roman. That was the icing on the cake. You were born Roman. I mean, it's in your blood. The other way is you could pay the Roman Empire a large sum of money and you could become a Roman citizen, which is what he did. Which do you think holds more weight? Being born Roman. Absolutely. And so the Roman centurion says, I paid a lot of money for my Roman citizenship. And what does Paul say? Oh, yeah? Well, guess what? I'm more Roman than you are. Trump card. I was born Rome. Okay, I was born that way. You purchased yours. You're a second-level Roman citizen. I'm first level. And that's what Paul is saying here. And so it says here in verse number 29, so immediately they all step back. This guy, he is true Roman. We don't want Rome coming down. So notice what this commander, he's at a loss for what, he can't let Paul go. That would be chaos in the street. And then to invite Rome to come in and bring peace, and of course, he pays the penalty for that. He's not about to have that happen. So the next day, because he, the commander, wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. Now, this whole council is what we call the Sanhedrin. Okay, this is the chief priests, this is the Pharisees, this is the Sadducees, This is all of the important religious and political people in Jerusalem. So, he doesn't know what's going on. He knows every time this guy gets loose, there's chaos in the street. So I'm going to bring in all the bigwigs, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the high priests. We're going to bring them all in. And then I'm going to bring Paul in, and we're going to figure out what's going on. That's his plan. All right? So let's see what Paul does here. As he does this, we see that Paul, still not sure of what the uproar is about, the commander calls a meeting with the Sanhedrin, and Paul has an opportunity here in the first 5 verses with his opening preamble. So Paul begins by stating that he lived with a clean conscience before God. Now, who is his audience? It's no longer the Jewish people out in the temple area. It's not the commander. Now it's the religious leaders and the political leaders and the high priest. So now we're talking about Jewish individuals, okay? So he says here in verse number 1, then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Now, that doesn't mean that on this day no longer. It just means up until now, up until this moment, I can tell you right now, I can testify before God Almighty, is what he's saying, that I have a clear conscience before our God that we all serve. Now, to us, that sounds pretty good, right? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So I do, all right? Clear conscience before God. That's what Paul is saying. Notice the response that he gets for such an honest statement. As a result, the high priest orders him to be struck. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Apparently, they didn't have the same conviction about Roman citizens as the commander did, right? Because the Ananias, the high priest, commands him to go down and to strike him on the mouth. Now, this is not just a little, slap. Let me share with you a little bit about what the word here, strike, means. It is the same word described in the beating that describes his previous beating out in the temple, and the same word that is used to describe the Lord's beating. Okay, so we're talking about a wallop. So here he is, and Paul says, I can tell you right now before God as my witness that I have a clean conscience before God. And so the high priest commands somebody there to go down and to smack him in the jaw and to beat him. Why is that so offensive to the high priest? I mean, if someone were to say that to you or me, even if we didn't like them, and even if we didn't believe them, we wouldn't say, hey, go hit him in the jaw, would we? So, why is he so offended? What would be, why is the high priest so angry with this? Joel. Oh, for sure. For sure, absolutely. The gospel, your message is not my message, right? Your message is not the law. You're getting very close. Who, under the law and in Israel, who was the mediator between Israel and God? Who was it? The one individual, the high priest. In other words, whoa. Nobody determines a clear conscience but me. I am the high priest. I am the Spirit. How is it that you and I can be so polar opposites? You can say this is your gospel. I look at that and I say that's blasphemy before God Almighty. And you say that you have a clear conscience. To them, that was blasphemous. There's no way you have a clear conscience. That's blasphemy. I would know if you had a clear conscience. I'm the high priest. It'd be like, he's offended because what Paul is saying is, I don't need a high priest. I don't need your position. I stand before God myself. Stephen, you had your hand raised. Absolutely. I know God's will. Such a blasphemous teaching. Yeah.
the mob was angry and being beaten. And what did they do? They strung him up to start beating him before they even knew why they were beating him, but they figured he did something.
He's guilty of something.
And then asked him, just to appease people.
Yep.
So, I mean, I'm sure that him and I were heard, so I think he's guilty and he was both God's name.
In his mind, it is not possible that God can be pleased with your lifestyle if I am so offended by it. And that's the idea there. There is no way you are pleasing God. And the very invoking of that name in this context to him is blasphemous. And so he has Paul hit. He strikes him in the mouth. Now understand that this is unlawful, as Paul has yet to be convicted of any crime. There's been no trial. He has been found guilty of nothing. In Paul's mind, Paul realizes who else was convicted under a false court of law. Stephen was, and who else? Jesus was. So Paul is already beginning to realize, I think, this is not going to be a fair hearing. No Christian gets a fair hearing. Jesus didn't get a fair hearing. Stephen didn't get a fair hearing. I'm being beaten before I'm even having a chance to even declare my innocence or to give my testimony. So this is not going to be a fair hearing at all. So here we see the appeal to the Pharisees. He was not going to get a fair trial. And so we read on here. In fact, look at verses 5, and I find this interesting. Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the... So back up to verse 3. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? In other words, you sit in the seat of the law, and yet you judge me contrary to the law. And so he says, God is going to judge you for this. And it's ironic because 9 years later, Ananias is indeed going to be judged by God. Ananias is beat to death by an angry Jewish mob. How ironic that Paul would say this. But in any case, he curses and condemns the high priest. And those standing by say, would you revile the high priest? And it's interesting what Paul says here. What do you think of that God is going to judge you? And somebody standing by says, how dare you speak to the high priest? And his response is, oh, I didn't realize it was the high priest. What are your thoughts on that? Because commentators go back and forth here. Anybody? Right. And some people think that Paul is speaking, oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were the high priest, type of a thing, being kind of snarky. And I don't know, that doesn't seem like Paul's character. Other commentators suggest that perhaps there's theory that his thorn in the flesh was that he had poor eyesight. Others suggest that perhaps he couldn't see well because he had just been beaten twice, right? And perhaps he really could not tell who was speaking to him. Some commentators suggest that because this was an early morning meeting that was called last minute, really wasn't even on the docket, that perhaps the high priest wasn't even wearing his royal regal robes. It was just dressed as a common person because it was not an official meeting. It was just kind of a last minute gathering of everybody else. So Paul didn't realize because he wasn't wearing his robes. In any case, I tend to agree with Joel that for whatever reason he did not recognize at first that it was indeed the high priest. But nonetheless, all this takes place. And so here we see Paul begin to strategize again. And to go back to our group, and I want to try to wrap this up quickly. We have three people before Paul this day. We have three groups of people. The high priest, right? We have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Let's not pretend they all like each other. They hated each other, all of them. They were different sects of individuals, all trying to control the people, all with different philosophies as to why and how. The only thing they had in common was that they all hated Jesus. And how does the saying go? The enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my. How does that go? The enemy of my. In other words, I can't remember how it all goes. In other words, if we both have the same enemy in common, you're my friend now, right? And so that's the idea. Very good. Very good. They had simply united in this one instance because they wanted Paul killed. So, and as a result, Paul realizes who is in the room. Okay, this is not going to be a fair trial. Again, this is probably going to end with me being taken out and killed unless there's an alternative presented. Paul realizes that before him are the Jew, is the Sanhedrin, or in the Sanhedrin are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees very religious. The Sadducees more agnostic. Pharisees believed in an afterlife. The Sadducees did not. Notice what Paul does here and tell me that it's not brilliant. Look at verse number 6. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees that did not believe, well, we'll read on because I think it clarifies, and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee. So now he's bringing out not just the social or the race card. Now he's bringing out the social status card, right? He cried out, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. He cried out, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. He cried out, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. He cried out, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a, I think is the right word. Just by saying this, it immediately ends the proceedings because look what happens in verse number 7. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. So what did Paul do? He created, Joel, go ahead, Joel. Absolutely. Exactly. If things keep going the way they are, they're gonna judge him, and he's gonna be taken out and killed. So what do? Hey, I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection. How dare you speak of the resurrection? What do you mean? We believe in the resurrection. There's no such thing. Yes, there is. And all of a sudden now these two groups are fighting each other. Paul sits back and notice what the commander does. Poor commander. All he's trying to do is get to the bottom of what's going on here, right? Now then there arose such a great dissension. The commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, who is now a Roman citizen, and now he has to protect Paul, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force. So now he gets arrested the third time for yet the same crime, and they have yet to find out why is he even guilty of anything. And so, and with this we will close. I just find it humorous here. He gets arrested the third time because now who has to protect him? The Roman commander does. He can't let a hair on his head be destroyed. He's got to protect him. And Paul has brilliantly set those who would accuse him against each other. All of this is going to allow Paul to make the next step up the ladder, and that's going to be the Jewish ruler. And we're going to get to that as we move on in chapter 23. We'll look at this next week. But we have to understand that all of these things that Paul is doing is not for his own preservation. He's not concerned with self-preservation. He is looking for every opportunity to keep moving up the ladder and to keep sharing the gospel with somebody else that would not hear the gospel otherwise. And whether or not Agrippa or Festus or Caesar or any of them, whether or not any of them are going to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, is not Paul's problem. All he is commanded to do is to share the gospel. And so that's what he does. All right, we'll stop there. I know we kind of went long, but I just find that whole scene to be incredibly interesting as Paul so really strategically understanding those against him, plays them against each other, so that he can just continue to share the gospel. That's his point. That's his purpose, is to share the gospel. All right, let's go ahead and take out our prayer list here. And I had dropped a couple that were on because they have been met, and so we don't need to keep them on the prayer list. There you go. If you can pass those around. Hey, if you want to just give me one real quick, I'll pass it back here to Stephen. All right, so continue to pray for Sharon and for Sharon's mom in Sheboygan and for the health there. Continue to pray for Joel's sister and for her salvation. I did take your dad off because you had mentioned that last week. Pray for Wendy's friend who has stayed. Actually, they have a couple of requests on here. Wendy does, I think 3 altogether. Her friend who has cancer. Her friend Lisa, who has breast cancer, and then a family that she knows that is going through some very difficult times, and they have a family member with cancer. So just be praying for the Sherwood's request there. Pray for Adair as she will be going to